Welcome back. Today we'll be reading from A Time for Miracles, Chapter 3. Zechariah and Elizabeth became second grandparents to all the children in town. The old man was fun to play with because of his ever present smile and his constant gesticulation. He played tag and blind man and swings, where he took the older children by the hands and spun them in giant circles until everyone was dizzy. With us, he nodded at us and tried to communicate. We didn't care that he couldn't talk. In fact, it was almost a novelty to have him invite you into his yard to play. Every day he tried to explain the miracle of the temple, and every day we laughed and played with him and left without understanding his motions. Elizabeth baked cookies and sweetbreads, holding them out to us through the window or bringing them to the door. She made little balls of fruit and nuts sticking together with sweet, sweet honey. Our mothers wondered why we never ate our bread and soup with the enthusiasm during those days. It was in the fifth month of our return from Jerusalem that I noticed that Elizabeth's smile had broadened. I noticed too that her body was broadening as well. I thought she was getting fat like many of the other old women in the village. To tell the truth, I had always wondered how she stayed so thin in her old age, while my mother and her friends all seemed to have gained weight with every ensuing child. Father said that it was the mark of the sin that kept them childless that kept Elizabeth so small of frame. And then she began to radiate. Her face literally beamed. Mother said that she had found blessing from the Holy One, though she couldn't understand why a woman of Elizabeth's age would want to start a family. Blessing, ha! My father would counter. This is just another sign from the Almighty to point out the sin of Zechariah. Mark my words, the child will be a girl, not a boy, which would truly be the blessing upon them. And even if it is a boy, he will bear the mark of sin upon him. He'll be blind or lame or marred in some other way upon his birth. Mark my words. Again we marked Father's words, and again we would see. To the children of the village, Zechariah and Elizabeth became even more loving and joyful to be around. Zechariah made more toys. Some he gave to the small children as they played with him, and others he stashed in a corner of his house. In the sixth month, another arrived. She was young. She was beautiful. She was somehow distantly related to Elizabeth. She had a ready smile that lighted on her eyes. She was pleasant to all of the children, even when she admonished us to let Elizabeth rest. She chased Zechariah out into the yard with a broom, saying, "Let her alone, she's tired. Keep this brood of ruffians busy and out of our hair." Elizabeth had no time to make candy and cookies for these little beggars. Elizabeth has no time to make candy and cookies for these little beggars. And we would laugh with her because of her spirit. I recall the day this Mary arrived. Elizabeth was unable to hide her condition any longer, and the women of the town were worried for her health. They had begun to argue among themselves about who would be responsible to help Elizabeth with the delivery. That is normally a job that falls to the mother or close relative of the expectant mother. Elizabeth's mother was long in the grave, and she had no close kin nearby to come to her aid. Mother might have offered to help out for pity of Elizabeth, but Father would not allow it. "You will not defile yourself by helping that woman deliver the child marked with sin," he declared. I think that my mother was secretly grateful. She had no real desire to be responsible for the act that would most likely cause Elizabeth's death. On the day Mary arrived, some of us were playing in and around Zachariah's home. She was humming a simple tune as she walked up the lane, and Elizabeth ran to greet her. Several of the women standing nearby, watching the younger children, gasped in disbelief. Why does she tempt fate, running as if in a race like that? They murmured to one another. Doesn't she know that she will hurt the baby and herself? I was near enough to hear the greeting with Elizabeth, which Elizabeth met her cousin. Hello, blessed one. The Almighty has granted you the blessing among all blessings. You are blessed among women, and blessed is the baby within you. How is it, she continued, that the mother of my Lord should visit me? I could see that the young woman, Mary, was surprised by this strange greeting, and apparently so could Elizabeth, because she went on to explain her strange words. When I heard your voice in greeting, my child jumped within me. It is a blessing to see the fulfillment of the words spoken by the Lord. When I later asked my mother about this, she said that babies move inside the womb often, but I had seen her face. I had heard her joy. I knew that another miracle was in the making. In the afternoon, as Mary busied herself around the house, helping to clean and put away clothes from the laundry, I overheard her singing, My soul magnifies the Lord. Her simple song praised the Almighty and told of the beauty that would be hers in days and years to come. She was thankful that people would bless her much in the way that Elizabeth had, not just those who knew her for the beautiful, loving woman that we would come to know, but for generations to come. This also was a puzzle to me, but I kept my thoughts to myself. Mary was a big help around the house, but she drew an odd number of young men around the home of Zechariah who chased these would-be suitors away. For her part, Mary kept the rooms clean and the yard in order. Whenever we came to play with Zechariah or taste of the cookies Elizabeth was ready with, Mary smiled and greeted us with a kind word. I noticed that she began to have the same glow that graced Elizabeth's face. That happy shine that Mother assured me was part of the joy of expecting a new baby. As it became evident that Mary too was carrying a child, the young men ceased to gather, and instead began to mock her. We had heard that Mary was the betrothed wife of a carpenter from her hometown. Some of the boys who found Mary to be attractive on her arrival and later made her an object of cruel jokes began to talk about the man who would have her as wife. One, Hoshea was his name, claimed to be from the young woman's town, and that he had expected the groom to be more upright than to take his wife before the proper time. Hoshea was in town on business and left before he felt the anger of the muted priest, who had taken to defending Mary when he wasn't trying to explain his vision from the temple. I would not know until later, but Mary's child would bear as much influence in my life as the miracle baby of our own town's Elizabeth, perhaps even more influence. But that is for later. For now, it was time for Elizabeth to deliver her miracle. On the day of his birth, Zechariah's son caused a great stir in town. Women came from all over the city to witness the event. It isn't every day that a woman of Elizabeth's advanced years gives birth to a baby. Only Mary and one or two other women were really there to help with the birthing process. The bustle of activity drew an attention of not only the women who stood in the front room of the small house speculating on the condition of the baby that was to be born, but also the children who ran and played in the yard, the older ones venturing occasionally to sneak up to the doorway for a peek, only to be shooed away by the women inside. The men, too, gathered for the spectacle. They stood around the yard, some finding makeshift stools to sit on. Some were pushing their way around Zechariah, laughing and patting him on the shoulders, making loud comment about how the old priest would understand the true meaning of joy and sadness. Joy because of all the wonder that a child brings to a family, sadness for the heartbreak that accompanies the growing and moving about of that same child. They talked of the son, for no one dared to suggest that this late life invader of Zechariah's home would be a girl, and what kind of man he would be. Certainly he would become active in the priestly duties, trained by his father and others. He would provide many generations to bless the faithfulness of Zechariah. After all, hadn't the old man waited faithfully longer than most, longer than any, for the blessing of a child? He could not be, how could it not be a son? How could he not carry on in his father's footsteps? Others of the men, including my father, stood on the edges of the yard quietly discussing what sort of trauma might befall this priest who had been struck speechless during our time in the Holy City. In hushed tones, they didn't dare to suggest that not only would the child be female, but she would be in some way deformed, probably including some kind of blindness and facial disfigurement that could not be hidden, as a further testimony to Zechariah's arrogance and sin. This group made sure to keep their opinions in their corner of the yard, but they also refused to leave, for they too wanted to witness the spectacle. They had yet to admit that it was a miracle happening before their eyes. And then everything began to happen. From within the house we heard the exclamations of the mother as she suffered the pain that always accompanied birth. She would scream and then whimper. The midwife would console her and remind her that she was bringing a blessed life into the world today. The screams continued and intensified as the labor dragged on. With each scream, Zechariah would turn expectantly toward the house. Finally, the screams of the birthing process were replaced with the strong cryings of fresh lungs. Zechariah jumped up from his stool, knocking it over in the process, and made as if to rush to the door. But the men surrounding him held the old man back until at last one of the women, who had not been in the birthing room itself, but in the front room away from the defilement of childbirth, gave word to me, for I was standing nearest the house. "Tell him a son." She told me with a smile, and I ran as fast as I could to give Zechariah the good news. The next 8 days were filled with preparations and argument. As the boy child was prepared for the ceremony of the circumcision, people began to bring in advice. Elizabeth insisted on calling the baby John. The women who came to visit and help in the preparations were perplexed. There were no men named John in the ancestry of either Zechariah or Elizabeth. Some wanted to name him Zechariah, and others were for reaching as far back as Levi to get the ancestral name. Father even came home one evening from his work, joining in the argument. "Nahue tells me that the old man is not questioning his wife's choice of a name," Father said as he walked in the door. "John, what kind of name is that for a Levite? Where did she come up with such an atrocity? I should think that they would choose a name that would not call attention to the fact that the child is odd. He was born too late in their lives for them to truly think that he will be righteous. And now they choose a name that will attract more and more attention to the fact that he is not natural." As the day drew near for the baby to be dedicated, everyone in the town began to contribute their ideas on how to name the baby. Mother and father had come to agreement that they would advocate for the name Josiah. Not only was it an ancestral name, but it also reminded us of the righteous king in Israel's history. But Elizabeth would not be moved. With the town turning out for the ceremony, the priest in charge again questioned the mother about the baby's name. John, she replied. Nothing else, only John. Amid the din of argument that followed, Zechariah began to motion for paper and pen. When finally this was produced, Zechariah sat down on his stool and laboriously wrote. When he was finished, the crowd grew hushed for the moment that he held up the message. His name is John.